When you want to erase a man, when you want to completely hide who he is, you have to remove every single trace of his existence. Not metaphorically, literally. His passport, his driver's license, his fingerprints from databases across 3 continents, the tags on his clothes detailing the store and the country of manufacture, the brand of cigarettes sold in only 3 shops within a mile radius, a receipt in his pocket, an address book, letters, a photograph in a police archive, a face in someone's memory, a name in someone's diary. This takes time. It takes professionalism. It requires the systemic mindset of someone who has done this before and knows exactly where people usually make mistakes. On December 1st, 1948, on Somerton Beach in Adelaide, Australia, a man was found who possessed none of these traces. Not a single one. He was wearing an expensive wool suit, not new, but cared for with the meticulousness of a man who understands that good things last if you look after them. His shoes were polished, without a single scuff on the soles, as if this man had never walked through mud, never rushed, never stumbled. A half-smoked Camel cigarette, an American brand, rare in 1948 Australia, was lodged in the lapel of his jacket, as if it had slipped from his lips at the exact moment he finally relaxed. His posture was completely calm, not contorted, not tense, with no signs of convulsions or a struggle. He looked like a man who had lain down to rest on the beach and simply never woke up. His face, a face with no signs of struggle, no grimace of pain, no expression of fear or surprise. The expression of a man who no longer had any decisions left to make. The police assume a drunk. Then they assume a suicide. They call in the coroner.
The coroner says every single tag on his clothing has been removed, not torn off in a hurry, not worn away by washing, not unpicked carelessly, cut out, neatly, with a sharp blade or manicure scissors, from every single item of clothing. The jacket, the shirt, the trousers, the underwear, the socks, even the socks. This isn't a habit, and it isn't an accident. This is a job. Someone spent time, attention, and a sharp tool to remove every identifier from every piece of fabric. The person who did this thought systemically. They didn't miss a thing. They take his fingerprints, good, clear prints. His fingers are well manicured, not rough, not the hands of a manual laborer. They run them through the databases. Australian, no match. British, no match. American, no match. A man who does not exist in a single archive is physically lying in front of them on an autopsy table. This is no longer an oddity. It is the answer to a question nobody had even formulated yet.
Cause of death, heart failure. But his spleen is enlarged to 3 times its normal size, the classic morphological sign of acute poisoning, visible in the tissues even when the toxin has already cleared the bloodstream. And it has cleared. There isn't a single known toxin in his blood. Nothing. Not a trace. The forensic scientists of 1948 test for everything they know how to test for: arsenic, cyanide, strychnine, morphine, barbiturates, and find absolutely nothing. The man died from a poison that either completely metabolizes in the blood, leaving only morphological traces in the organs, or was administered in a dosage calibrated precisely to the capabilities of toxicology at the time. Just enough to kill, just enough to leave 0 trace in standard tests. Both scenarios demand one thing: knowledge. Not an accidental poisoning, not a domestic murder. Professional knowledge. An understanding of the biochemistry of the poison and the exact capabilities of the local forensics lab in that specific year. Stop for a second and think about what this means. Someone in 1948 knew enough about toxicology to choose a poison that Australian pathologists would be unable to identify. You don't get that knowledge from a library book. You get it from the classified R&D of an organization that handles these kinds of things professionally. This isn't a story about a mysterious corpse on an Australian beach. This is a story about a perfect identity erasure operation that almost worked. We aren't going to look for the victim. We are going to look for the person who erased him. And we are going to find 3 points where the system failed. 3 details that couldn't be foreseen even by the most professional people in the business of making other people disappear.
During the Cold War, and 1948 was the very beginning of it, the Berlin blockade started in June of that year, and the first Soviet atomic bomb test would happen a year later. Western intelligence agencies had an established protocol for dealing with assets that needed to be eliminated without a trace. This protocol wasn't written down in official manuals. It existed as operational practice, passed from instructor to operative. But declassified materials from subsequent decades allow us to reconstruct it with considerable accuracy. First, the physical destruction of identifiers. Documents, tags, any items indicating a name, place of purchase, or country of origin. This is done in advance, not in the heat of the operation, because during an operation there was no time and mistakes are inevitable. Identifiers are removed methodically, in a calm environment with total focus. Every item of clothing is checked separately, then checked again.
Second, a neutral location and a neutral posture. The body is never hidden. Hiding a body means that sooner or later it will be found, and it will immediately be classified as a murder. The body is placed in a public area in a posture that most convincingly mimics an accident or a suicide. The police waste days and weeks chasing standard theories. By the time they realize what they're looking at, the trail is ice cold. Third, a traceless poison. In 1948, the most likely candidate, according to professional pathologists, was digitalis, a foxglove glycoside that, in a precise dose, causes cardiac arrest via ventricular fibrillation, clears the bloodstream relatively quickly, and at the time wasn't part of the standard toxicological screening in most labs. A person who knew about digitalis as an instrument of death rather than as a medicine had specialized training, the kind of training provided in very specific places. Fourth, absence from databases. This is the most complex element of the protocol and the one that speaks the loudest. An absence from global police databases in 1948 meant one of 2 things. Either the man had never been arrested in his entire life, not once in any country that shared data, or his card had been pulled. The card catalogs of that era were made of paper. Physically removing a card from a police archive is technically no harder than cutting a tag off a jacket, provided you have access to the archive, and certain organizations had certain access. Everything listed above was executed flawlessly. Every point of the protocol was observed. The work was professional, methodical, with no visible oversights. Except one.
Inside the trousers, there was a tiny, hidden fob pocket. Not a standard one. Not the kind tailors sometimes put in the lining for a pocket watch or coins. It was sewn in separately, purposefully, by hand, by skilled fingers that knew exactly why they were doing it. It was impossible to find during a quick pat-down. Only through a methodical, detailed inspection of every seam and every layer of fabric. And they didn't find it on the day of his death. They found it 6 months later, during a re-examination of his clothing by a pathologist who decided to double-check what had already been checked. Inside the pocket was a tightly rolled scrap of paper, the size of a postage stamp. 2 words: Tamam Shud.
The final words of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, in Latin transliteration, written in the 11th century by the Persian poet and mathematician. They mean one thing: finished, the end. It is completed. A scrap of paper with those 2 words lay in the hidden pocket of a dead, nameless man on a beach in Australia in 1948. Investigators stared at it for a long time. They spent weeks wondering what it meant. Then they found the book it was torn from and realized they understood absolutely nothing. A few days after the body was discovered, an unclaimed suitcase was found at the Adelaide railway station. Analysis showed it had been checked in around the same time the body was found on the beach,
The storage fee was paid, the ticket was issued, and nobody ever came to claim it.
Inside were high-quality items, well cared for, clearly belonging to a man who knew how to look after himself and understood the difference between cheap goods and quality craftsmanship. Tailored trousers, shirts, shaving gear in a leather toiletry bag, everything neatly folded, not shoved in hurriedly, but packed with the muscle memory of a man who had packed for the road many times. And once again, not a single tag. Every one of them had been snipped off with the exact same precision as the suit on the beach. Someone had gone through the contents of the suitcase with the same sharp tool, using the exact same methodical approach.
But there were 3 items in the suitcase that defied total sanitization. Not because they were forgotten, but because on their own, they weren't direct identifiers. No name, no address, just objects. Yet they spoke volumes to anyone who knew how to listen. Orange barber thread of American manufacture. A highly specific color from a highly specific manufacturer. In 1948 Australia, this thread was not sold in any store, anywhere. The man had either been to the US or someone had brought it to him from there. Or a third option that cannot be ruled out. It was placed in the suitcase intentionally as a false trail leading away from the truth. None of these possibilities made the picture any clearer.
A stenciling brush of a specific design, flat, stiff-bristled with a metal handle, a tool used in Army quartermaster operations for marking crates, shipping containers, and military gear, and simultaneously a standard tool used by covert agents for physically marking documents and dead drops in espionage networks. The exact same object in 2 entirely different contexts. Which one applied here was a mystery. Waxed sewing thread, a very specific material, not ordinary tailor's thread, but waxed, treated for durability and water resistance. It had one specific application in operational fieldcraft, sewing hidden pockets into clothing, the exact kind of pocket they found in the trousers. The man who carried this thread either regularly sewed these pockets for himself or sewed them for others. Neither of those is the hobby of an ordinary civilian. The man sewed hidden pockets into his own clothes. He carried the thread for it, not as a tailoring hobby, but out of operational necessity that had become a habit. He had either been trained to do it, or he had taught himself because it was required for the work he did. The police started searching for the book from which the Tamim Shud scrap had been torn. It wasn't an easy task. Khayyam's Rubaiyat had been published in English in several versions, and the specific Oxford edition from which this exact scrap was torn was relatively rare in Australia.
The search took weeks. The book was eventually found by a local doctor. He brought it to the police himself months later, when the story of the body still hadn't gone fully public. He found it on the back seat of his car. He had left his car unlocked, a common habit in a provincial South Australian town where in 1948 nobody stole anything. Someone had taken advantage of that habit. They tossed the book into a stranger's unlocked car and walked away without leaving a trace. This wasn't a random choice of location to ditch the book. It was the intentional creation of distance between the book and the person who planted it. When the book is found, the trail leads to a random civilian, to a random car, to the habit of leaving doors unlocked. It doesn't lead to the operation. This is the mindset of a person who plans chains of consequences well in advance.
On the back page of the book was the faint impression of pencil writing. Not ink, not pencil graphite. The writing had been erased. All that remained was the indented relief left on the page beneath it, a negative of what was written. Forensics shone ultraviolet light on it from different angles. They recovered the text. A telephone number and 5 lines of capital letters. No spaces, no punctuation, no obvious structure. The phone number led to a woman, Jessica Thompson, 27 years old, a nurse. She lived in Glenelg, a suburb of Adelaide, just a quarter mile from Somerton Beach, a quarter mile from where the body was found. A detective visits her, carrying a plaster death mask cast from the face of the dead man. a standard identification procedure when photographs aren't enough. A plaster mask conveys volume, skin tone, and facial expression far more accurately than a 2D snapshot. Thompson looks at the mask. According to the detective's official notes in the interrogation transcript, she was completely taken aback, to the point of giving the appearance that she was about to faint. The phrasing in that report indicates that the detective had to wait for her to collect herself. He saw her reaction. He recorded it exactly as it happened. Because that kind of reaction when looking at the face of a total stranger is impossible. People don't faint over strangers.
Thompson collected herself quickly. She stated she did not know the man, had never seen him, had no idea why her phone number was written on the back cover of the book. The detective wrote down her statement. He didn't press her. Under the protocols of the era, he had no grounds to detain a witness who denied any connection. Formally, the case hit a dead end. But Jessica Thompson had a son. In 1948, he was 3 years old. His name was Robin. In 2019, Professor Derek Abbott of the University of Adelaide, who had spent years investigating the case, compared Robin Thompson's DNA with samples extracted from the exhumed remains of the Somerton Man. The result? A genetic match at the level of paternity.
Jessica Thompson knew this man. She knew him very well. A son who was 3 years old in 1948 means an acquaintance dating back to roughly 1944 or 1945. The war years. Years when Australia was overflowing with men in uniform from dozens of countries, when the cities were transit hubs for Allied military and intelligence personnel, when relationships were formed quickly and circumstances didn't lend themselves to detailed biographies. Jessica Thompson took this secret to her grave. She died in 2007 at the age of 85. She never gave a single public comment. Not to the police, not to journalists, not to her children, not to her grandchildren. Nearly 60 years of absolute silence about a man whose plaster mask nearly made her pass out. As to why she stayed silent, there are two possibilities. Both are equally probable, and both are terrifying in their own way. First, she was told to stay quiet, or warned about the consequences if she didn't. In 1948, she was a young woman with a toddler. The people who orchestrated what happened on that beach were not the kind of people you say no to. Second, she didn't want to talk, not out of fear, but out of understanding. She knew what this man did for a living. She knew enough to realize that the less said, the better. For her child, for everyone. Her silence wasn't cowardice. Her silence was the choice of a person who had seen enough to know the exact price of words.
Now, let's look at the context. Most versions of this story treat the context as background noise, but the context is everything. Adelaide in 1948 was not a quiet provincial town at the edge of the world, living a sleepy, peaceful life far removed from global geopolitics. It was a city situated just miles away from the Mount Painter uranium mines. In 1948, the Mount Painter uranium mines were a strategic asset of global significance. Uranium meant the nuclear program. The British nuclear program was spinning up in exactly those years. The first British atomic test would take place in 1952, right there in Australia, in the Montebello Islands. During this period, Soviet intelligence was running aggressive human intelligence, HUMINT operations, targeting uranium assets worldwide. This was the era of the greatest atomic espionage cases in history. Klaus Fuchs, the Rosenbergs, and dozens of lesser-known breaches.
It is a matter of historical record that in the late 1940s, several Soviet agents were operating in Australia. Operation Venona, the decryption of Soviet ciphers by U.S. intelligence, mentions Australian contacts. Adelaide was the perfect location for a transit agent or a courier, far enough from Sydney and Melbourne to avoid the constant scrutiny of counterintelligence, but close enough to the uranium sites to justify the presence of a technical specialist. An electrical engineer in Adelaide in 1948 isn't strange.
It is the perfect natural cover. The 5 lines of letters from the back cover of the book were sent to the cryptographic departments of the Royal Australian Navy, then to American specialists. The work took months. The best cryptographers available were brought in. The conclusion was unequivocal and final. It was a one-time pad, a system in which every message is encrypted using a unique random key that is used only once. Mathematically, it is an absolutely unhackable system. Not difficult to hack, mathematically impossible. Without the physical key, it can never be decrypted. Not by any method, not by any computing power. Not then, not now, not in 100 years. This wasn't the cipher of an amateur who read a book on codes. It was a professional covert communication system used at the time by several organizations: Soviet intelligence, British MI6, the American OSS, and its successor, the CIA, which had been founded just a year earlier in 1947.
Ordinary people do not carry encrypted messages based on one-time pads in hidden trouser pockets. Ordinary people do not know how to sew hidden pockets. Ordinary people do not die from an untraceable poison right in front of a coroner's eyes. In 2022, Professor Derek Abbott published the results of a DNA analysis of the Somerton Man's remains, cross-referenced with living relatives identified through genealogical databases. The name? Carl Charles Webb, born in Melbourne in 1905, an electrical engineer. According to existing records, a thoroughly ordinary middle-class biography. Married. In 1947, he walked away from his family, disappeared.
No espionage background in open records. No visible ties to intelligence agencies. An engineer. Educated. He knew Persian poetry well enough to carry that specific quote from that specific book in the final moments of his life. But it must be said, the DNA analysis didn't make the mystery smaller, it made it bigger. Because now the mystery has a specific face, and that face does not match the answers it was supposed to provide. If Carl Webb is just an engineer who left his family, where did the hidden pockets, the one-time pad, and the untraceable poison come from? If Carl Webb was recruited, by whom, when, and under what circumstances that left absolutely zero paper trail in the open archives? If his identity was professionally scrubbed from databases, that means someone with access to those databases knew his name before his body was found on the beach, which means the people who eliminated him knew exactly who he was, and they eliminated him anyway. The DNA gave a name. The name didn't give an answer. The answer just went deeper. Carl Webb could have been recruited in late 1946 or 1947. That is exactly when he left his family. That is exactly when he vanished from the life he had known. The timing is circumstantial. It isn't proof, but it isn't a coincidence either. An electrical engineer with technical expertise is valuable to an intelligence agency, not as an operative, but as a specialist who understands how communication systems, power grids, and security systems work. Exactly the kind of knowledge needed at facilities near uranium mines. Recruiting technical specialists as couriers or cutouts was standard practice at the time. They weren't given access to classified documents. They were given a route and a contact. A person on the other end to whom a message needed to be delivered. They didn't know what was in the message, only how to deliver it and to whom.
Jessica Thompson could have been that contact. Not a field operative, not an intelligence officer, just a person who received drops and passed them up the chain. A cutout in a network where every link only knows the link directly before and after it. A classic compartmentalized structure that protects the entire network from collapsing if one element is compromised. Carl Webb traveled to Adelaide, met with Jessica Thompson, delivered what he had to deliver, went back, traveled there again. During one of those trips, in 44 or 45, something more than an operational contact happened between them. A child was born. That made Carl Webb more than just a career. It made him a man with ties that couldn't be controlled.
a man who had a living anchor in Adelaide. A living anchor is a vulnerability. In the intelligence world, you do not leave vulnerabilities.
In 1948, a year after Carl Webb vanished from his official biography, someone decided the mission was over. Tamam Shud. Who decided that is unknown. Whose side Carl Webb was working for is unknown. Whether he was taken out by his own people or the enemy is unknown. In the Cold War, which effectively kicked off in 1948, those questions sometimes lacked answers even for the people making the decisions. Because lines crossed, agents worked for multiple masters, and the definition of our guy shifted depending on what was needed in any given week. Now, let's talk about the 3 system failures, because they provide the structural answer to how this operation actually worked.
The first failure, the hidden pocket with the scrap of paper. The person conducting the sanitization either didn't find the pocket during the search, or they found it and left it there intentionally. The second option is vastly more terrifying than the first, because it implies that the Tam Shud scrap was left as a message. To whom is unknown. About what is unknown. Or perhaps it was left by Carl Webb for himself, as the final period at the end of a sentence he chose to end himself. The second failure? Jessica Thompson. A living human being who couldn't be eliminated without creating a second case, a second investigation, a second body that would demand explanations. She couldn't be erased. She could only be asked to stay silent. And she stayed silent for nearly 60 years. But she left a son. And the son left DNA. And DNA does not stay silent.
The third failure? Biology. In 1948, DNA analysis did not exist. None of the people who planned the operation could have foreseen that 74 years later, a name would be pulled from the bones buried in the ground. They destroyed every identifier they knew of. They couldn't destroy something humanity didn't even know existed yet. They built the perfect disappearance system based on the capabilities of 1948. They couldn't build it for 2022. Carl Webb stayed silent for 74 years. Then he spoke through the DNA molecules in his own bones. He gave his name. Everything else remained silent. Because the people who could say more are dead. The people who knew didn't speak while they were alive. And the archives that could answer the questions are either destroyed or classified for durations exceeding a human lifespan.
Somerton Beach today looks like any other Australian beach. Sand, surf, tourists with kids. No plaque, no memorial marker. The place where a nameless man was found in December 1948 is just a beach. The city around it has grown and changed. Houses have been torn down and rebuilt. The people who remember that day are long dead. But the case lives on. It is debated in academic journals and on true crime forums with equal intensity because it offers a rare combination: absolute historical documentation and absolute in-resolution. Every new fact doesn't make it simpler, it makes it more complex. Every answer spawns 3 new questions. This is the definition of a true rabbit hole. Not one with an exit at the end, but one where every turn reveals a new corridor fading into the dark.
The cipher on the back of the book remains unbroken. Mathematically, it cannot be broken without the key. The key existed in the head of one or more people, and it died with them. 5 lines of capital letters have sat in the archives of the Adelaide Police for 75 years, and they will sit there for 75 more, or forever. They contain Carl Webb's last message, or the first message meant for him, or the instructions he was supposed to pass on, or a goodbye that no one was left to read. Nobody will ever know. And now, the ultimate question, the one the investigation has never been able to answer. If the words Tamam Shud in Carl Webb's hidden pocket meant exactly what they mean in Persian, finished, the end, it is completed, then was it the last message he didn't have time to deliver, found by accident 6 months later?
Or was it the last thing he wrote for himself, in that exact moment when he put on his best suit, polished his shoes, took his last cigarette, and walked down to a beach just a quarter-mile from the home of a woman who, upon seeing his dead face, nearly fainted, and who then stayed utterly silent for 59 years, taking everything she knew to the place from which no one returns with answers?